Well, hello. I think that this is connected. We will see. So this is kind of the last, actually, likely, of this type of stream. I'm probably going to transition a little bit, but we'll talk about that at the end of this video. This week, we are going to talk about mass battle, and well, specifically...
I think that this is connected.
Okay, I need to disconnect that. Whoops, okay. So anywho, sorry. So yeah, we're going to talk about mass battle, blah, blah, blah. That's where my words were going. And so this week we are going to discuss one type of mass battle. Probably not necessarily my favorite part. I don't know that that's actually true, but definitely the type that I think is best suited for most game masters. And that is the type inspired by Legend of the Five Rings. The 3rd edition revised is the book that I pull from. So I hope this is given a little bit of time for some people to get online. So let's get started. Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more. Close up the wall with our English dead. In peace there's nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. But when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger. Stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood, disguise fair nature with hard favored rage, then lend the eye a terrible aspect. So that was the first part of the speech that Henry gives his troops in Henry V. It's the feeling that players want from mass battle and from warfare, the clash of swords and wills, glory and honor from sacrifice, serving country and family. It's powerful stuff. It's really what has inspired humanity to war for generations, for centuries. And this is really the feeling that we're trying to invoke when we talk about mass battle and why we run it and why it's so central to many tabletop role-playing games, especially fantasy-inspired ones like Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, Dungeon World, so many different things. So let's talk about mass battle. How do we do it? And when do we use it? Because I think that's an equally important question. We can talk about, different systems and thoughts and what really makes warfare interesting. But I think the key thing to think of and know for game masters is when to use mass battle. Because I don't think it's for everything. If you're running a game of Vampire the Masquerade, then you're probably not going to have a lot of mass battle in it. I really think we're mostly talking about fantasy or historical or at least historical settings. And, this is a thing of the past, of armies being, waged against each other. So I don't use mass battles and systems that are story-driven. Vampire the Masquerade, Paranoia, let's even say 1st edition of Scion. I might, but it would probably be more of a background thing. Mass battle that the players, rather the characters, are actually involved in. I'm probably going to use that in things like D&D and Pathfinder and tactically minded games. If we're talking about Blades in the Dark, there ain't exactly a good clock for mass battle. There could be, but it's unlikely. So think on this. When you consider adding some sort of war to your game, does your game really support it? And does it make sense for your setting, for your system, and for your game, really? So I have 3 methods for this today. We're going to talk about method 1. And in method 1, your PCs are regular soldiers. They are part of a unit, and you are just going to play your characters. There's no overarching things to it. You're really going to just be your characters in a unit, and that unit is going to be in the battle. Now, maybe you are the generals, but you're generals in the fight. And that's the big key here, is this is not a system that you're going to use if your players' characters are not in the fight itself, in the mass of bodies and heat and steel. This method comes from Legend of the Five Rings, specifically the 3rd edition revised. There were mass battle rules that allowed you to really simulate a party of characters engaging in mass battle and making a difference, but really they were just another group of soldiers. They might have been the best soldiers on the field, but it is also very possible and very likely that they were just lucky. They were in the right place at the right time, and the things that are going to happen to your soldiers here are really a matter of luck in many ways. It's a matter of rolling dice and the scenarios that they get into. So what is this? The battle proceeds in turns. And I will say that this system does use the term turn very frequently and in different ways. It's kind of unfortunate, but let's think of battle turns or battle rounds, or warfare rounds. At the beginning of the first turn, players are going to decide how engaged their characters are. There are 4 levels. There's reserves, disengaged, engaged, and heavily engaged. Each level, they are closer to the front lines, per se, and they are more likely to face tougher opponents and tougher scenarios, but the chance for great glory and the chance for really changing the tide of the battle is very high the farther in you go. When you're in the reserves, in multiple battle turns or warfare turns, you could actually do nothing and thereby just not contribute. But in heavily engaged, it's very likely that you will, end up in a tense situation and something very, very amazing could happen. So each warfare turn, after that, a group can move 1 level. They can go, from engaged to disengaged or heavily engaged, but they can't go from engaged to the reserves. And at the beginning of each warfare turn, the players, or one player, and the game master make rolls to see how the battle is going. That roll is influenced by what the players did in the last warfare turn and how well they did as well. So they may have faced a small combat with a couple enemy soldiers and just absolutely decimated them in a couple turns. That's going to give them a bigger bonus than if they faced those same soldiers and it took a while and it was a big slog and was a really hard, tough fight for the players. As opposed to, they could also face absolutely nothing and contribute nothing. That doesn't mean that the roll can't go in their favor. This roll is weighted heavily upon the circumstances of the battle and the generals of that battle. Those are the ones who are, quote unquote, making the roll, supposedly. So being in the being in the reserves is the chance of being healed. You could meet, battlefield medics who are going to help you. But like I said before, there's a pretty heavy chance where just nothing happens. You're back there waiting for some sort of something to occur, or just resting, and licking your wounds. But it also carries, So then to heavily engaged, it's a lot. You are almost guaranteed to face a fight every warfare turn. But this is where you get some of the opportunities to take down the enemy general, or steal the enemy's banner, or break a full line in the enemy's front line. It's really big stuff, and that is the key here. I do want to bring attention to one thing here. So on the right side is actually the heavily engaged card from the Legend of the Five Rings card game from the early 2000s. That card game is actually what led into the tabletop role-playing game. It does not start as a role-playing game. It started as a card game, very interestingly. And if you want to hear more of that story, there's actually a video that Matt Colville made about the card game that I not only really enjoyed, but actually knew a fair bit amount. I have a lot of friends who were in that card game community back when it launched and when a lot of those events occurred. I'll link that video in the description, but it is absolutely fantastic, and it's a really fantastic card game. If you have friends who are into very tactical, not collectible card games, kind of, but not really. But yes, a card game between opponents, kind of like a collectible card game. So each of these events adds or subtracts from the army's roll. The more dangerous the event, the greater the bonus. The better you do, the greater the bonus. Winning that roll means your army gets closer to routing the enemy and to ultimate victory. There's typically a set amount that you have to be positive when you win that roll. You get +1, +2, +3, for instance, and then when you lose that roll, you get -1, -2, -3. If you get to, let's say, +4, that's when the ultimate war, the ultimate battle is actually over. But losing that also does mean that your army is closer to being destroyed, and it is possible to lose a battle in this system. And I think that's actually very important, that when you have a warfare system, there is the chance to lose, and that chance is not nothing, Now, that chance should depend at least some point on your player's choices and your character's choices. What's the point in playing an RPG if we're really just going to be regular-ass soldiers that have no impact on the battle whatsoever? But at the same time, what's the point in playing a mass battle if you know you're going to win no matter what? That's exactly the same thing that I say for combat. Why are we fighting an enemy if it is absolutely you are going to win no matter what, unless there is another reason? And in the fact of warfare, there is very little other reasons to carry out the mass battle. You could just tell them they win and carry through it that way instead. So, Legend of the Five Rings. Let's talk a little bit about the system and what makes it special, what makes it unique, and why this system is kind of pretty heavily based on, Legend of the Five Rings, but can easily be used in other systems as well. Legend of the Five Rings is a game about the fictionalized samurai ideal, glory, honor, and sacrifice. Yes, I did that in red, white, and blue. No, there's no meaning to that. Those are the important parts of Legend of the Five Rings, especially those early editions. And so that means that you can't just take this system, put it in Dungeons & Dragons, and just call it good. There are aspects of this system that just don't work in every other game. There is a whole thing about dueling in Legend of the Five Rings. It's a big deal, and there is a chance in these mass battles that you could be called out to a duel on the battlefield. Well, is that going to work in a system like Dungeons & Dragons? No, it's not. But there are some events in this table that, in fact, I would say most events in this system could be carried over to any other system of mass battle and into any other system of role-playing game. So let's talk a bit about that. There is show me your stance. That's a thing that results in the duel. I brought that up already. Most events also result in the player characters gaining glory, which is an actual mechanic in Legend of the Five Rings. Is that a thing in Dungeons & Dragons? Maybe not. It could be in your setting. Glory could be very important. Maybe warfare is such a huge deal in your world that glory in battle is actually tangible, and you can take more of that system and and bring it over to D&D. But the other benefits that can be given, bonuses to your army's roll, extra bonuses maybe after the battle, maybe magic items that are granted to you for saving the war, for saving the battle, that's big. And that can be something that we utilize in a system like Pathfinder or D&D. So I'm going to go through kind of my favorite story using the system. This was actually in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and this was actually in the Plot of Conquerors. In fact, the battle that I talked about in a couple videos ago with Briark, the first time that I ran Plot of Conquerors was actually run using this system. And so they faced, the player characters faced a goblinoid army. They had behind them the dwarves and creatures in Blackstone, but the player characters were a unit. They were an individual unit in this fight. So they started at engaged. And the general on the Blackstone side had a pretty okay bonus to the army's roll, but so did the goblinoid general. And so it was relatively evenly matched. And I told them that. They knew what they were getting into. And I think that's actually very important with this system, that your players know what they're getting into and know, is this going to be easy? Is it going to be hard? How much do we need to really get into it? Or how much can we hang back possibly and maybe live? Because this is a very deadly system. You're going to face many encounters in a row, which in most systems is a big deal. So the party fights a few relatively easy encounters at engaged, and after 2 turns, they decided to advance to heavily engaged. So now they're really in the thick of it. They finally they get an opportunity to break the enemy lines and to steal the enemy's banner. Now the key with the steal a banner event is that you have to win the combat and get through the line. You then have to succeed on another combat, grab the banner, and then you have to retreat to reserved. And that takes multiple, war turns, and you're going to fight someone that entire way. It actually changes the roles to determine what you fight and guarantees that you fight certain amounts of soldiers on the way back. So they fought a very tense battle against very high armor class enemies, and that was the front line. These are soldiers with shields. I gave them a skill, ability called Phalanx Fighter, so they got +2 AC whenever they were next to another person with a shield. So it drained a lot of resources. It was tough, but they did win, and that allowed the whole army to flow through the hole that they made, and then they grabbed the enemy banner, and they succeeded, and that was another tough fight. They're fighting bannermen. Bannermen should be hard. These should be the people that the army trusts enough to carry the morale of the fight. And so they then retreated back to engaged. They got unlucky, fought another really tough encounter. I want to say it actually involved like multiple hobgoblins and some super stealthy bugbears. And then they retreated and disengaged again, got unlucky again, got another really hard fight. I think it was literally just an army of goblins, if I remember correctly. So it was like 20 goblins or something like that. But through some lucky rolls, they survived. They were basically drained of spells, abilities, everything at this point. They finally got to reserves, and then they actually didn't have a fight there. They actually met their army's healers. And so they sat there for a turn. They got healed. They got okay. The fight wasn't quite over, but it was really close, and I told them that. They were just one roll away. So they did decide to go to disengaged, didn't fight an encounter there, and then the battle ended. This was, really just 10 war turns. It was not that long. 9 fights and that's it. But it was 9 fights in a row. After each one, they got 1 round to do any actions that they wanted before the next war turn happened. So it was hard, but the system is meant to be hard. It's meant to wear the characters down, as a real battle does. And, to a point in that mass of bodies, does an individual person matter? Well, sure, when we look at it from a top-down perspective, maybe that person is the one that grabs the banner and runs and really routs the enemy and starts the whole win. But most just die unceremoniously. And that's really what the system does so well. My players knew that the battle would be up to die rolls because they were relatively even, the generals were, and they knew they had to do something. So they stayed engaged. They stayed engaged and then heavily engaged, and they got just the right moment, which is exactly like, these mass battles should feel, that they got lucky. They got just the right thing to be able to turn the tide. And in fact, that's actually what the role for the war turn is called, is the Tides of Battle roll. So that's what they did. They made a big move. They retreated. They licked their wounds. And then they went back in again because they still weren't sure that it was safe and clear. They had really smart use of their abilities. They tried to spread their spells out as much as possible, and they really tried to utilize their soldiers, their player characters, in the best way to survive each individual encounter as itself, as an individual encounter. So, what is this system not so good for? It's not good for players that don't want to be in the middle of a battle. It's not good for games where, characters dying on a battlefield because of bad luck or in undramatic ways isn't satisfying and isn't, kind of part of the game. A part of D&D to me is that sometimes players die, and sometimes players die unceremoniously. And, at least in this system with D&D, you can make it a big deal that they died in this big battle. But this is a system where characters might just die. They might just get in a bad situation and die. And if your system's not made for that, look at a system like Overlight. Overlight is not something where, dying on a field in a battle is really a remote possibility. Or, many, don't use this in Tales of Equestria, the My Little Pony role-playing game. I don't think characters really meant to die in that at all. It also doesn't really work at too high of a level of play either, of a power level. When your characters are too powerful, they can kind of survive all kinds of things, and challenging them with even just fight on fight on fight on fight on fight on this unending battle, even that can still not really challenge them. Well, unless they were fighting a battle so hard that it's still a challenge, like against an army of demons led by a fallen angel. But that's a story for another time. So yeah, what about this is something that you can make unique and that you can do interestingly? Well, you should make your own battle scenarios, there should be scenarios that are unique to your fight. Your fight should have specialized units that the enemy is using that maybe the player characters will never interact with again. There should be interesting things here. Make your players interact with that, because I guarantee there will be cool things in your world that will be fun and interesting that can incorporate into a warfare system that you can't necessarily incorporate into a dungeon crawl or a hex crawl or anything else that your players are doing. Also, allow your players good ideas to be rewarded. And I really mean this for almost anything. I think that's just good advice for games. Allow your players good ideas to be rewarded. But, let's say, for instance, possibly referencing the images below, that your player characters are at the disengaged level and they remember something about the battle, that the battle is happening in a gorge between two cliffs, and they want to find some explosives and find a way to collapse the cliffs onto the opposing army and really give them a huge bonus to Tides of Battle. Find a way for them to do that. If it was me, I would probably say, okay, you need to get back to reserved, but you're gonna have to spend multiple turns in reserved, and that means and during each turn you're gonna have to make rolls to try and find those explosives and find everything you need, and each turn that you don't succeed is a turn you're not contributing to this battle, and that could be big. Tell them the risks. Tell them, hey, by the way, you could just lose while you're looking for these explosives, but if you do, then you need to go back up to disengaged, and then you need to take a turn or two again, make those rolls, whatever, and then if you succeed, then you figure out a way to do it. And that could be amazing. Maybe they pull it off in one round. Maybe they just come back to reserved. They immediately find the explosives. They go back to disengaged. They immediately fire them off. And it is this big, heroic, hell yeah, we won. We destroyed that opposing army. But maybe it is this big slog. It's multiple rounds at both spots, and they're staring down enemies coming closer and closer, and they're losing and losing, but then they finally pull it off, and it is this big rallying cry to win and to succeed. So that is the first type of mass battle. Homework this week: what unique things could your players face if they were in your current game and they were in a war? What kind of unique things could be on the opposing side? Something I want to kind of call out here. There's a book on the right side there, Grunts by Mary Gentle. I absolutely love this book. It is a fantastic examination of inverted fantasy storytelling, where an army of orcs on, the dark wizards, the dark side of the world, find a collection of modern weapons, and with that comes the knowledge of modern combat. And it is very intriguing. It's really a favorite of mine. I'll probably do some more book reviews as we're going through streams like this. I think that it's very, very intriguing. So Grunts, I really recommend it. It's a great time. That is the cover right there. If you haven't read it before, you really should. I think it is such a great breakdown of the fantasy genre, the sci-fi genre, the historical genre, as well as just a great story. Mary Gentle is a marvelous writer, and she's a great time to read. So next week is something a little different. Not class dismissed just yet. There's one more slide. So I am participating in something called Dungeon 23 this year. If you haven't heard of it, it's a very intriguing idea where game masters for tabletop role-playing games say, okay, I'm going to build each day one room in a dungeon. And then each week is one level of that dungeon. And then at the end of the year, you have a mega dungeon. Making a mega dungeon is such a, it can be a difficult task for people because they feel like it has to be effortless, and it's not. It is difficult. Making mega dungeons and just making large things in it all is a lot of creation. It's a lot of work. And so I am participating in that, kind of. I've transitioned it a little bit to a system I really enjoy called Mutant Year Zero, and the image that you can see below is actually a Google Earth image of New Orleans and the surrounding area. Mutant Year Zero is set in our world in a post-apocalypse, and it is set on a map of the real world. And so I took an image of New Orleans and I've separated it into sectors. And each day I'm going to make one sector rather than one room in a dungeon. If you are interested in Dungeon 23, please look it up. There's a subreddit. It's a great time. It's a really supportive community as far as I've seen so far. It's some really cool people making really fun things. And it's a great way, no matter what, just to get some inspiration. And so next week I'm going to start documenting my my progression on Dungeon 23 and talking about the sectors that I'm making, talk about Mutant Year Zero, because there's very few videos on YouTube about Mutant Year Zero. It's a really fun system, but it's not Dungeons & Dragons, so people don't talk about it. And I think that's a crying shame. So, yeah, come back next week, same bat time, same bat channel. We're going to start talking about Mutant Year Zero, start talking about Dungeon 23, and it's just going to be a gosh darn good time. Well, ladies and gentlemen, namely Zach and Freddie, the people who actually watch these streams at this point in my channel history, have a wonderful day. Hope you're not too cold up in the Great White North, and you all have a wonderful